You mind if I turn the light on?
No, go ahead.
Yeah,
I've never been much of a note taker. I just like to listen.
You don't have to take notes anyway. There's nothing that important.
Well, don't sell yourself short.
So, one of the things that I was, when Chris asked me to do this, I was like, why did you pick me? But the more I began to think about my philosophy about teaching or about Hispanic work, I realized why. It was for me, because my wife and I are both missionary kids. I grew up in Colombia, and she grew up in Italy, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and the Dominican Republic. And then we took our kids and went to Latin America as well. So I've spent, of my 51 years, I've spent 23 or 24 in Latin America.
Wow.
And so she spent a few more than that. So we've grown up in a mixed and blended work. We've always been a part of it. So let me ask you this question. So what comes to mind when I say Hispanic or Spanish-speaking ministry to you guys?
Well, I mean, I immediately think we have one at Saginaw, and they're completely separate from us.
Okay.
They just use our facilities, and they like it that way. They're a very conservative, small little place, and they've been there for years.
Okay.
They don't really grow. They just kind of have their own little meeting group, and you know, there's one lady that sings on Wednesday nights, and her voice is so terrible. It just kills me when I hear it. But it's to the Lord, so it's good. But you know, I've seen that model, and then I've seen in Stockdale, Texas, there's a bilingual ministry.
Yeah.
And at first, the basic bilingual would be they would have Spanish songs and they have English songs. And I know they had Spanish classes, but the preaching was in English, and I don't know that there was a translator. So it was somewhat blended together. And there's a very large Hispanic population in Stockdale. And
I was just at Nixon a few weeks ago, helping a bilingual church. So you have the kind of extremes in that. So before we get into what I want to talk about this first session about the myths that we often believe about Hispanic ministry, let me give you some definition of things. Okay, what's the difference between Hispanic and Latino? Because we often think they're interchangeable, but they're really not. The word Latino comes from, or was coined to be people who come from a country that has a Latin root language. And so you have, as far as that, you have all the Latinos. You even have Brazil, and you have Portugal, and so you have a Latin group of people. They're the ones who come from a country whose roots are Latin, the Spanish language, or the language. Hispanic are those who come from Spanish-speaking countries, or who have Spanish as their primary language, or Spanish as their heritage. So once we start talking about it, you can be Hispanic and Latino, but you can also be Latino without being Hispanic. So a Brazilian is considered Latino, but not Hispanic, because he speaks a different language.
Yeah, they speak Portuguese. Speak Portuguese in Brazil, right?
Yeah. And so there's also another couple of countries in Latin America that are also the same way. So we have to keep that in mind as we group all of Latin America as Hispanic, and they're really not all Hispanic. There's some that aren't, some that are not. And then this one is, when we talk about generations, first generation immigrant or first generation Hispanic, and we're talking about people here in the U.S., they are the foreign born. They're the ones that immigrated here at some point. So they are the first generation. Those who came in are the first generation. The second generation is the generation that their kids who were born here, or the kids of a immigrant and a national. Okay, so they're considered second generation. And third generation on are both U.S. born. Okay, both their parents are U.S. born in that process. And so what we have in that process is that we look at Hispanics, and they're such a large group, we've got to figure out where they fit, because each one's a little bit different. And they're showing now that the fourth generation is the generation that are trying to get back to their roots. The second generation and the third generation are not, but that fourth generation wants to know about great-grandma and where they came from. So you're not finding that until the fourth generation. There are three terms that I want us to see: enculturation, Because if you talk about enculturation, it's the culture that you grow up in, and it just gradually becomes who you are. So we grew up here in the U.S., and so we're enculturated into the U.S. culture. Acculturation is when you go to another country and you try to assimilate that culture. Okay? And in that, you have to work hard at learning the customs and the traditions and things like that because they're not normal to you. Enculturation is they just become part of your day-to-day life. The third culture is a term that is defined by people who blend two cultures in their lives. Okay? So like my parents went to Columbia. I grew up in Columbia in those formidable junior high school years. Okay? And so I'm not North American and I'm not Colombian. I'm kind of a mix of the two. So that's what a third culture comes into play.
Is that more typical of your second generation Hispanic?
Exactly. Okay. The first generation gets to be somewhat of a third culture, but they're limited because they still have such a strong initial culture. The second generation, they can't. The second generation. We'll talk some more just about this in the second class because it's key to understand because when we look at it, it makes a difference to how we reach that generation. Okay. But my kids grew up on the mission field. They grew up in Chile. Well, their parents are North American, but their parents also grew up in Colombia and Nicaragua and Dominican Republic. So they're just a mixture of cultures. And they don't fit in either one.
Yeah.
So that's what we find. And that's really important because what we'll see when we get to Hispanics is we got a whole group of them that really don't fit in either place, in either category. Okay? So what are the 4 myths? Not all Hispanics eat spicy food. Okay? Dan Rodriguez, he's a writer and he's a faculty member at Pepperdine. He did an article years ago that he called it not all Hispanics eat tortillas. Okay, and so we find that Hispanics come from very many different countries, but we group them as all one group when they come to the U.S.
That's true.
Okay, so the myth becomes that they're all Mexicans and they all eat spicy food, or they're all Mexicans but they're not. And so as we deal with that, there's over 60 million of them in the U.S. But there's only about 50 of those 60 that are from Mexico. So you bring in a whole different aspect of it. Their foods are different. Okay, so their foods, what they like to eat, what would you say is the most typical Hispanic food?
Taco.
Taco.
Yeah.
Okay? You go to Walmart and you go to the Hispanic food section and it's tacos and Mexican food. Well, that's not what most Hispanics eat. Most Hispanics don't eat that. They eat things like pozole, which is Mexican, or mole, which is Mexican. But in Bolivia, they eat salteñas, which is a different type of meal. Or they could go to Cuba and what they eat is called ropa vieja, which is this one right here. It's a meat, beans, and rice mix. No tortillas. Okay? You go to Argentina and it's just a meat cookout. That's what their favorite meal is. They grill out meat. And so one of the things that we struggle with in bringing them into the U.S. and calling them Hispanics is we think they're all alike, and they're not. Okay? And even in their language, they're not all the same. You know what coche means? You ever heard it?
I haven't.
Okay, coche in Mexico is a car.
Okay.
Okay? But in Guatemala, it's slang for pig.
Oh.
And then in Spain, they use carro. In Chile and Uruguay, they use auto. So all Hispanics, they have different words for different languages. And here's just a couple of other ones, and I'll show them to you. Okay? Chucho is the word used for marijuana. But in Argentina, it means cold.
Oh, wow.
Or in northern Latin America, it's slang for dog. And in Chile, it means go to jail. So all of these words have different meanings. Guagua, which is in some countries is a baby, in other countries it's a bus.
Wow.
Okay? And then rato, like you're going to say, I'll see you in a little bit. You say, I'll see you in un rato in Mexico. But in Latin America, if you say, I'll see you in un rato, that means you'll see them tomorrow or the next day. So one of the struggles that we have in dealing with Hispanics and trying to develop Hispanic ministries is that they're all different. So where do they say they come from? So if you look at the Hispanics, I've got till 10:45, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you look at Hispanics, if you look at what their firstborn, the firstborn or the foreign born will claim that about 97% of them will claim him to be Hispanic. Okay? The second generation, 92%. The third generation, 77%. And even the fourth generation, even though they've never lived outside the U.S., still claim themselves to be Hispanics. But they've never lived outside the U.S.
Yeah.
Okay? Even so, that if you're foreign born, you will identify with being Hispanic or Latino, but you'll also identify with the country you're from. So you ask somebody where they're from, and they're going to tell you which country. What's incredibly impressive is third and fourth generation Hispanics in the U.S., you ask them where they're from, and they'll still say the mother country. Because of that strong heritage in their life. So we only have about a third of Hispanics in North America that would claim themselves to be North American or American. Okay? But in reality, they're almost all born here. Okay? So that's the first one. We run into that. And so you have this third, and third, but almost all Hispanics still claim that Hispanic roots, even though they might not have been there. So let me ask you this question. Oh, no, that's the next one. So the next myth, all Hispanics are foreign born and illegal. You ever felt that? You ever heard that? So
yeah,
sometimes
I've heard
when we
it.
look at Hispanics, sometimes when we look at the idea of Hispanics, we think, oh, illegal immigrants are immigrants. So what percentage would you say of Hispanics are immigrants?
Maybe 20%.
Okay.
In the U.S. right now?
In the U.S.
10%?
10%. So 20% of them, 1/4, or 4 out of 5, are all U.S. citizens. And so when you look at Hispanic works and look at the idea of doing Hispanic works, we have to remember that 4 out of 5 of those Hispanics are U.S. citizens. And if you look, it breaks it down even more, is you've got 30% that are third generation, 34% that are second generation, and these are most recent statistics. But only a fourth of the immigrants are undocumented. So the statistics are showing only about 11% are undocumented. But we think a lot of them are. Okay? So we have to look at that as a myth in that process. So the question becomes, how do we change our approach to Hispanic ministries if we are not just targeting that first generation Hispanic? Because that becomes a question.
Yeah.
Question. Right? The third myth. Spanish is a requirement to reach Hispanics. You ever think that? Heard that?
That's said all the time. Like when you look at like job descriptions, or when we get emails about helping people find preachers, they always say, we need somebody bilingual.
Bilingual.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, bilingual aspect is very important, but if you look at the statistics of Hispanics, of the foreign-born, the majority of them do speak Spanish. But if you look at the U.S.-born, only 57% of them actually speak Spanish. Okay? So if only 57% of the Hispanics that we're looking at speak Spanish, do we really need Spanish to reach them? Even this is interesting statistic because if we're looking at Hispanics, if you look at U.S.-born Hispanics, only 11% of our U.S.-born Hispanics say that you must know Spanish to be Hispanic. So there's a whole shift in that culture that says most Hispanics don't have to speak Spanish.
Yeah.
But our Spanish ministries focus on Spanish speakers. So what does the fact that most Hispanics are English dominant or proficient mean about developing Hispanic ministries?
I think you have to look at more of their culture and less of their language.
Okay.
And say, how do you reach Hispanic culture in that's already sort of situated in a city or place that you live in?
That's exactly true. So we have to look at how do we create this cultural aspect to it, but it's not necessarily a Spanish aspect to it. That's why some of these little Hispanic churches, they don't grow because they're targeted so only that Hispanic portion. Okay? And here's the fourth myth that I've found that comes up so often, is that Hispanic ministries will always just be a burden upon the bigger church. You know, is the Hispanic ministry always just going to be that small group that we just have to keep them functioning? And what's interesting to me is in this process, by the year 2030, 1 out of 5 workers in the U.S. will be a Hispanic. And if you look at the trajectory of the Spanish salaries in the U.S., as of today, or as of last year, the statistics, they're making almost 50 grand a year. Okay? So they're not barely getting by like 30 or 40 years ago when they were first a big immigration. So we're going to have to figure out, they don't have to be that burden because they can give just like we can. But we may have to work on how do we do that. How do we do that in that process? Okay? So those are the 4 myths that we often run into when we think about Hispanic works, because we think Hispanic is this what we've seen for so many years. Okay? Okay, so what are the challenges facing Hispanic ministries? If we look at wanting to do a Hispanic ministry, what are the main challenges we will run into? The first one is cultural assimilation. Okay? Because we're not talking about cultural assimilation in just them adjusting to the U.S. culture, but we're talking about a cultural assimilation that Hispanics are not homogeneous. They are very heterogeneous. Okay? So when we have Hispanics, the first way we see that Hispanics immigrate into the U.S. to become part of a church that's focused on immigrants, well, we've got Colombians who have a different culture than Mexicans. And we've got Argentinians who have a very different culture than the Mexicans. And so we have to figure out in that process to assimilate and to create a Hispanic work, we have to figure out what that's going to look like culturally. Because if we don't, they're just as mixed up in that process as we are. Okay? So how do you make, and so the challenge becomes, how do you create a Hispanic work or a Spanish-speaking work or a Spanish-oriented work that brings in up to 22 or 25 different cultures? Because they look very different. So that becomes that challenge. Okay? So in that process, cultural differences are real. And they impact everything we do every day. Okay? They impact our leadership philosophy, our theology, and they impact our discipleship. What does that look like? What does that bring into play if you've got Hispanics coming in from so many different places? So it's not just about Spanish-speaking ministries. It's about speaking ministries. Okay? Questions, comments?
I'm just liking the kind of the different approach, because I guess like a lot of times when I hear about Spanish ministry or I'm at a church, I've only been at a church like one time in my life where there's been a concentrated effort. They hired a Spanish minister, you know, all those kind of things. And I met everybody. I talked to everybody, but it didn't last long. It died very quickly because people had some of the same misconceptions that you're talking about. And so I've always thought that Spanish ministry can work, and I've seen it, you know, where it's been legitimately helpful, and there's been like I said, an English congregation, a Spanish congregation, but the assimilation has always been a struggle, because most church members most churches I've been a part of have been white, majority white, and bringing anybody else in is it's not that they're racist, but they just don't know what to do, don't know how to connect.
So in the second class, we'll look at some principles that will help us do some of that as we look.
Cool.
But we do have this, in this cultural assimilation, we have this complexity of identity. Who are these people? Are they Argentine? Are they Mexican? Are we North American? Because if you say North America, Mexico's North American, but they're Hispanic descent. And so you create this in trying to just bring them together because they all supposedly speak the same language. creates an identity issue that the church is really going to have to figure out how to deal with. Okay? Because the Spanish-speaking congregation, which I'll get to in just a minute, but the Spanish-speaking congregation is the fact that we have to find this balance between a safe space for first-generation Hispanics as well as a safe place for third-generation Hispanics who are not Spanish dominant.
I think there's a gap between usually the first and second generation, maybe even the third, where younger people want to get more into the Anglo side of church and culture and break away from the first generation culture, and that can cause some conflicts. I've seen that personally in the work that I do, that younger generations don't want, and I found two different sides of Hispanic religious belief in general. And one of those is the very ultra-conservative that goes as far as to say we don't celebrate holidays. There was one belief that you don't cremate because you won't be resurrected from the dead. Right. And then on the other side, you have the much more Pentecostal, very expressive views. And there's not a lot of in between. So when you have people assimilating into, let's say, more of an Anglo church, there's tension between the generations. And I've seen that because the identity, what you're talking about, it's very much there. And a lot of the second or third generation Hispanics want to assimilate more into an American culture, and that can be an awkward transition.
And it's not that it's not just as much as they want to; it's they are.
Yeah, I mean they're already there. So
I've seen many a times. You got, and I saw this 2 weeks ago. I worshiped at the Spanish congregation in Shreveport or Bossier City, Louisiana. First generation Hispanics. They all speak Spanish, and they're all. But the kids of those first generation, they did not really feel comfortable being in that whole Spanish-speaking church because they barely speak Spanish themselves. So if they don't feel comfortable there, well, we send them over to the Anglo side, and the Anglo looks at them and says, "But you're Hispanic, so go back over there." And so the second and third generation, they're like, "Okay, do we go over here and be with these people?" Who we don't really understand them because we didn't grow up like them. We assimilated, we enculturated another culture, or do we go over here where they don't think we're alike, and so then we don't fit here either. And so you have this complex identity of the second, third generation, fourth generation Hispanics are like, where do we belong? Okay, and you've got the dominant church saying, well, you belong over there in that small room, or you belong over there in that church, or you belong over to a church that speaks Spanish. But if I'm a third generation Hispanic that doesn't speak Spanish, I don't belong in the Hispanic speaking church or the Latin or Spanish speaking church. And so you have this complexity of this assimilation. So what do we do about assimilating culture? And I think that's one of the things that we miss out so much in that process, because we have to figure out in this assimilating cultures, we have to get away from these cultural generalizations and these stereotypes. Okay? Stereotypes like Latin Americans, immigrants, are here to steal American jobs. That's not as common today as it was 20 years ago, but it's still underlying. Why do the Hispanics come to the U.S.? Well, because they want to get our jobs. You hear that. Okay? And you hear that from godly Christian people.
Yes.
That's the harder part. You hear it from godly Christian people. Or the idea that all Latin American women are only homemakers and cleaning houses. Statistics show that between 25 and 50-year-olds, over a third of those Hispanics are in the workforce as doctors and lawyers and teachers. Right? They're not housekeepers. And the last one is the Latin Americans are unwilling to learn English or speak English. Well, if they come here, they got to learn our language.
Yeah.
Well, when 2/3 of them are born here, they already speak the language. They don't have to learn it. So you have this process. If you want to create a Hispanic ministry, you have this cultural challenge in that process. And then you have a challenge of this idea of religious background. Right? What is the religious background? Do we understand Catholicism? Do we understand the Pentecostal that comes from the Hispanics? Do we understand where this traditionalism, this conservatism comes into play? Because Hispanics, Catholicism is very different depending on the country that you go to. Right? There are some general things that are very common, but there are some practices and some issues and some things that they bring as Catholics into that society that we don't often understand. And just to give you an example of that, in the work that we did in Chile, we worked in a middle upper class, and it was a predominantly Catholic group that we worked in. We were first generation Catholics. We could not get our Catholics to participate and help out in ministry. It was a challenge. It was such a challenge to get that. And then we began to study the roots of the Catholicism in that region is that the priest does everything for all the people. And so you're trying to bring a group of people and to get them involved in worship or get them involved in serving, and they're so accustomed for so many years of 200 years of generation after generation that all they have to do is go to church, do their confession, and go home, and they're good to go. Okay? So how do you bring that into a church that needs to be more active, more proactive, and everybody's healthy? Right? Or Catholicism in many countries in Latin America, probably farther south than north, is Catholicism is a cultural thing, not a religious thing. Well, that means culturally, I have to go to Mass once a year. I go to Christmas Mass or Easter Mass, and I have to do all this, just these one-point things. Well, to convince them to be engaged as they come to know the Lord and begin to come to know the Lord and be engaged in a day-to-day walk with the Lord, that's not their cultural heritage. So you have to figure out how that looks in their process. And Catholicism is social structures as well. In most Latin American countries, as they come in, and even Catholics in the U.S., if you leave Catholicism, you leave your family structure. You're out on your own. And so you bring in that process to deal with those issues with those in that process. And then you have this issue that we've come to find out, and this is the conservatism issue here. What is it that we do is doctrine, and what is it that we do is cultural? Right? What are the important things that determine whether what we're about to do today in our worship service or in our church life, is that cultural or is that doctrinal? And things like starting time. Are those cultural or are those doctrinal? Okay. Sunday morning, is that cultural or doctrinal? Okay, so those are just some fun things that we can look at. But there's so many more of those underlying things that we have to figure out. Okay, what are we doing today in our culture or our church culture that might not be a doctrinal issue, but it just might be a cultural issue? How do we greet each other? How do we carry on our conversation? How do we share prayer requests? And typically in the larger Anglo church, you don't really share a whole lot of prayer requests, but you sit with the Hispanics, and they're all about sharing prayer requests. So how do you do that? And so the second challenge becomes, okay, how do we do that in that process? The third challenge that we have is leadership replacement. And leadership replacement is a challenge we all face in all churches, because the next generation are not becoming Christians, or they may be, but they're not staying as Christians, and they're leaving and they're losing, and they're moving on into other things. And so in that process, how do we take a generation of Hispanics and bring them into the next generation, or being the next generation leaders? It's more of a challenge in the Hispanics because the second and third generation are much different than even their parents. Their parents or grandparents came in as immigrants. That next generation is very different. And so how do you teach them and how do you work with them to bring them to a point where they're able to take on those roles of leadership? Because a young generation Hispanic is not going to think about that structure that a lot of the Latin American churches we see have. They're going to think differently. They're going to think about diversity, and they're going to think about inclusion, and they're going to think about all these other things in life that the older Hispanics that are now in control of the churches don't think about it. Okay? And we have that same issue in the churches, in the Anglo church as well. But we have to figure out how to do that. Right? So we have to figure out, how is this replacement issue going to work? Because a Hispanic church that was established in the 70s, it might still be going. Those leaders are very different than if we started a Hispanic today that needed leaders in that process. So leadership replacement is a big challenge. The next one becomes heterogeneous leadership. What does that look like? Heterogeneous leadership means that our leadership, if we're going to plant Hispanic works, then this is what you were talking about today. If we're going to plant Hispanic works, typically what happens is the Anglo church tells them kind of what they're going to do or how much money they're going to have and whatnot, and they just kind of abide by that. And they may have a minister, they may bring a minister in. Well, what do? You've got two churches in that process, but one church is dependent upon the other. Okay? I read a statistic that very few churches are able to diversify or make their leadership heterogeneous. Right? Very few churches, even if we're going to have two ministries, how many church ministries or how many church elderships that have Hispanic works have Hispanic leaders? Not many. How many churches do we know that do a great work in the Hispanic community, but all their eldership and their leadership in their churches is all Anglo? Mm-hmm. How well can they fully understand the Hispanics? So we would find that in diversity in everything. If we want to reach out to the Hispanics, we need to have more in the leadership body of the church. We need to have more Hispanics so that it's not these two churches. If we want to reach out to the Afro-American community, we're going to have in our leadership, in our diversity, in our culture, is going to have more of them. That's very important because that's a challenge that we will face in developing that leadership and looking into that leadership concept of what that's supposed to look like. Because they won't stay or they won't grow if the leadership is not accompanying them in that process. And I know that because there's a church that I work with out in West Texas. They have a Hispanic ministry, but the guys do not understand anything about what the Hispanic ministry does. And so they make decisions for the Hispanic ministry that doesn't function for them, and then they have trouble. They can't figure out how to do that. And the last one about we need to learn to be an empowering leadership. If we're going to let them be a church and let them partake and move and grow and all that, we have to allow them to do that. But so often our leadership decides for them what they're supposed to do and what they're not, and they don't let them decide. So they empower. Visited a church in Louisiana that the church didn't even allow them to have their own communion trays because they didn't want to waste. So what they would do is do times where the Anglo church had communion first, and then they would bring the trays over there and let the Hispanics do it after that. That's how this interaction between Anglo and Hispanic churches was working, right? But they didn't empower them to do anything. They changed their room and they kicked them out of one room without even asking them about it. Things like that. So in leadership and empowering and heterogeneity, we've got to figure out how to work that process in that process so that they can be who they need to be. Okay? And then the last challenge is resource availability. Most churches in the Latin world, or in the Latin-speaking community in the U.S., are extremely poor. They have no money to do anything. But I believe it's not because the Hispanics are not generous, it's because they haven't learned to grow in their generosity towards the church. Because you look at Hispanics, and they support not only their family, but they support an aunt and uncle over there and an aunt and uncle over there because they're very generous people, and they share these things with people. But they haven't learned to share with the church in that. And if they're making $50,000 or $60,000 a year, which is the median, they should have the capability to sustain themselves as a church. But there are very few Hispanic churches that can sustain themselves. And so what we're going to have to do, just like we do, have to learn in generosity. We have to learn to give money in that process to sustain that, to make it their own church. Right? They have to learn to grow in their giving. They have to learn to grow in sharing what they have, and they have to learn to grow in how to become those people. Right? And then the other one in the resources, we have very few in our community, our church community, that are able to building those bridges. We don't have, or we don't emphasize the need for ministers or youth ministers or family ministers that are about bringing those two groups together. Okay? They're just not there. Okay? There's not many. There's a few here and there, or by default, one of the youth from the church is kind of serving in that role, but he's really not because he's just a youth. And so we need to bring about more bridge builders in the process. We need to be training and talking to second generation and third generation Hispanics that they can be the bridging agents between those as our ministers for both congregations, not just one. Okay? So we have to bring that into that process, because that's the final one. It's not just about, okay, you do your own thing. It's not about that. It's about growing, but it's about bridging that gap, is what we'll talk about in the next session. Okay? So the final thing becomes is when I think of Hispanic ministry, and I know I'm probably I don't fall within everybody's category on that. When Paul writes to the brothers in Corinthians, he says to the church of God that is in Corinth, to those sanctified in Christ Jesus, called to be saints together, with all those who are in every place called upon the name of the Lord. He's not wanting two different churches. He's not wanting two different groups. If we're going to have an outreach in this community Hispanic, he wants those to be together in that process. How do we do that? That's where the challenge comes. Any questions, comments?
I mean, that last point I think is really important, because as you see second and third generation Hispanic groups, I've been in a couple of congregations where there are two groups. One of them was in George, West Texas, very Hispanic community, and a lot of the younger people did not speak Spanish. But there was also a Hispanic church in George West, and I always wondered aloud, and I talked to the leaders while I was there. I was there about 3.5 years. Why don't we join congregations? Because there weren't hardly anyone there that didn't speak English. It was a matter of they liked their church and they liked their culture, but it was such a small town, there really was no need for two congregations. But because they had been built up so separately, you had different identity, different culture, and it almost seems, even though George West has about half and half white and Hispanic, the Hispanic church is still separate. And I just wonder, what will they ever be able to combine as one congregation? Because that would make so much more sense for the strength of the church.
And it would make sense to reach out to the Hispanics that are not there because they don't fit. You know?
Absolutely. And so, I've seen it in other places done. I used to go to a congregation at Abilene that had a full-blown Spanish ministry. And they outgrew the little room that they were in, so they just left. They just took off, which was fine, because I'm guessing they got their own building and did their own thing. But I don't know that anyone who was in the Anglo congregation ever got to know anyone in the Hispanic church. And we're in that situation at Saginaw where it's not that we don't want to know people in the Hispanic church. They just don't want to have anything to do with us. And I don't think that they dislike us. It's just they're afraid that we're going to take their members away. And so they are very protective of, they'll say hi to us, we'll wave to them, but it's almost like they want to stay in this bubble. And I just hate that.
It's that exclusion stuff. You stay over there, I'll stay over here.
Yeah.
Which is a underlying current in the culture.
And it's not our end. We have Hispanic members, and we want, and we could probably accommodate Spanish-speaking people if we needed to. It's just
so one of the things that happens in a lot of Hispanic ministries that are solely Spanish, and they're old school kind of Spanish ministries, is it becomes more about maintaining their culture than it does maintaining their church. They want to be that church because that maintains that I speak Spanish and I'm Mexican and I'm this and that. So they want to. So it becomes about maintaining their culture or their tradition as Hispanics, which some of those probably brought in from wherever they came from, than it does about being part of the larger body.
Makes sense.
And that's why we don't have that association with them, or they don't have that with us. And I think it goes both ways. You know, the stereotypes and the generalizations go both ways. But how they do that is because they don't want to let go of what they were. They don't want to assimilate into a different culture, which is so amazing. We'll talk about in just a minute. Is they're not segregated in the workforce, but we segregate in church.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's all I had for the first session.